Hi everyone, and welcome to Liberty Live. Normally it's in the past I've called it Liberty Me You, but we're doing a little rebranding with our move to Adobe Connect. So this is the new space. I think it's going to be a much more dynamic space for us to do 25 plus talks every month. I think it's going to be great. I'm really excited about what we can do with this. But welcome to Liberty Live. We're here tonight with Dr. Roderick Long. Roderick is a professor of philosophy at Auburn University. He blogs at his own blog, the Austro-Athenian Empire. He also blogs at Bleeding Heart Libertarians and elsewhere. He's a senior scholar for the Mises Institute, an editor of the Journal of Ayn Rand Studies, director and president of the Molinari Institute, and a senior fellow at the Center for a Stateless Society. And tonight he's going to be talking about virtue ethics, a kind of Aristotelian approach to the question of, how do we get to liberty? So, without further ado, Roderick Long.
Oh, thanks. So, the libertarian movement for a long time has been divided on the question of the proper foundations, moral foundations for libertarianism, and with the main divide being between, broadly speaking, consequentialists on the one hand, those who think that the uh, the justification for respecting libertarian rights is its consequences. This might take the utilitarian form of consequences for society as a whole, might take an egoist form of consequences for the agent, him or herself, or some mix of the two or something else. But the idea is that the justification for liberty is sort of causally downstream from the rights themselves or from respecting rights. It's the effects, the beneficial effects of respecting liberty. On the other hand, the deontologists, often called the natural rights position, although some natural rights theorists are egoists and it's complicated, but the natural rights position that certain actions are inherently wrong, like violating rights is inherently wrong in and of itself, apart from any consideration of its consequences. And certain criticisms each side makes of the other. So, for example, the deontologists will say, look, so you consequentialists aren't really committed to liberty. Your commitment to liberty simply depends on your happening to think that it has these consequences, but if you can see some way to promote those consequences differently, then you'd betray liberty, and you'd be quite happy to use people as mere means to ends if you could do that. And the consequentialists will say, look, you deontologists are crazy. You are committed to liberty regardless of its results, so that if it turned out that liberty had horrific consequences, that the libertarian society would be one that would be a nightmare of civil war and poverty and mass death and so forth, that you'd still be in favor of it. Also, each side accuses the other side of hypocrisy, because the consequentialists will point out that the deontologists, although they say that their reasons for favoring liberty don't have to do with consequences, nevertheless they all seem to think that in fact liberty will have good consequences. So, as a matter of fact, most deontological libertarians subscribe to, for example, free market economic theories that say that respecting rights will tend to produce more prosperity and peace and so on, even if they think that that's not the reason for favoring liberty, the fundamental reason. They nevertheless seem to sign on to it, even if they describe it as, in Rothbard's words, gravy. And so the consequentialists think, well, there's some hypocrisy here. Really, the deontologists are crypto-consequentialists. Really, they're smuggling in some kind of consequentialist concern in justifying liberty. But of course, the deontologists can turn around and make a similar accusation against the consequentialists, which is, well, look, you consequentialists say it's the results that you favor, not respecting personhood in its own right or something like that. But nevertheless, the values that you hold all seem to involve respecting personhood, and you seem to favor acting as though we believed in natural rights for their own sake, and you try to show that consequentialism doesn't entail nasty consequences like sacrificing the few to the many and so forth, that if you're a utilitarian, or sacrificing others to yourself if you're an egoist. The consequentialists try to show that their theories don't have that implication, and that makes it seem as though there's some kind of crypto-deontologists. So there's that worry. And also there are some, broadly speaking, praxeological worries about both positions. So with regard to consequentialism, here's a kind of praxeological worry about it. Praxeological in the sense of arising from sort of conceptual problems about the nature of action. One thing that seems to be generally agreed on by consequentialist libertarians is that the best way to promote good consequences is to adopt certain very general settled policies and to hold to them pretty firmly, and not be too ready to recognize exceptions. So for people with a more utilitarian bent, like Mises or Hayek or the Friedmans, they seem to think that if you try to follow a policy of expediency and are constantly violating libertarian rights, and anytime you see some way of gaining some social advantage for that, they tend to think that that will tend to be, make liberty unstable, and that you should stick to these principles pretty firmly. Likewise, if you're an egoist like Ayn Rand, you're going to think that in order to pursue your self-interest, you should commit yourself to general principles and policies and not be constantly looking for ways around them. Libertarian consequentialists tend to be what's called rule consequentialists, not act consequentialists. That is, they tend to think that consequentialism shouldn't be a criterion for determining which individual actions are correct, but rather should be a criterion simply for determining what general rules or policies or principles should be followed. But there's a praxeological worry about this, which is the take the praxeological distinction between producers' goods and consumers' goods. So consumers' goods are goods that are valued for their own sake. Producers' goods are goods that are valued for the sake of their consequences for producing something else. So according to consequentialism, liberty is a producer's good, and respecting rights is a producer's good. It's valued for its consequences. But the rule consequentialist position seems to be that we should treat respect for rights as though it were a consumer's good. We should treat it as though we valued it for its own sake. And the worry there is that either we really are valuing it for its own sake, or we're just pretending. If we're just pretending, then it seems like we're not really going to be very strongly committed to the principle. We just act as though we value it for its own sake, but if we really are all the time thinking of it as a producer's good, as something that's valuable solely as a strategy for achieving some goal, then any time you see a way of promoting the goal by violating the strategy, you're going to do it. It's just like following the instructions on your GPS is a generally good policy because they're usually right. But you shouldn't drive off the cliff if the GPS says there's a bridge there and there isn't one. You have to use your own judgment. So if you think of principles of liberty as something like a general guideline, a rule of thumb, like do what the GPS says, then you're going to violate it anytime it looks as though you can produce better results. On the other hand, if what consequentialism tells you to do is really to start valuing rights as in themselves, you value them because valuing in themselves will tend to have good consequences. You should get yourself to value them for their own sake. It's like if there's some pill and taking a pill will make you care about these things for their own sake, then you should do it. But in effect, then consequentialism is telling you to take a pill that will make you no longer be a consequentialist. But the problem is that once you've taken the pill, once you've gotten yourself into the right frame of mind, it's not clear that you can coherently endorse consequentialism anymore. But there are praxeological worries for the deontologist too. Because the deontologist says that there's some rules you need to follow, regardless of any other values you have, any other commitments you have, anything else you happen to want. All these things just seem to count for nothing in the face of these ironclad duties, these categorical imperatives, or whatever they are. And that's kind of a puzzle, because praxeologically, if you value something, that commits you to pursuing it. And so how could there be some rules that simply say you have to set aside whatever it is you value and just go after these rules? That's praxeologically puzzling too. Okay, so I want to talk about virtue ethics, which is a third tradition, an alternative to both consequentialism and deontology, more or less, although there are overlaps. You can certainly find consequentialists try to incorporate a lot of virtue ethics into their theory. I think John Stuart Mill would be an example of a utilitarian who tries to incorporate a fair bit of virtue ethics. I think Rand would be an example of an egoist who tries to do that. And also, I think that Kant could be a deontologist who has some virtue ethical aspects too. So this isn't a hard and fast distinction. But by and large, the virtue ethics tradition focuses neither on actions in their own right as the primary criterion. So the idea that just certain actions are inherently right or wrong, certain rules just inherently you have to follow, and where the consequentialist instead looks at causal results, the virtue ethicist focuses on moral character. And moral character is sort of secondary for both consequentialists and deontologists. They both say, well, first we figure out what's right, following the right rules according to the deontologist, promoting the right results according to the consequentialist, and then the person of good moral character will be whichever one actually has that result. But so the good person is defined as the one who produces those good results or follows those good rules. But virtue ethics wants to make the question of character more front and center. So the fundamental question is, what kind of person should you be, rather than what actions should you pursue? If you were fans of Babylon 5, you could think of this as the idea that you should answer the Vorlon question, who are you, before you answer the shadow question, what do you want? If you're not a fan of Babylon 5 or not familiar with it, then just, the jury is instructed to disregard that example rather than trying to figure it out. There are three main traditions that are usually associated with virtue ethics. So there's the ancient Greek tradition, starting from Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, and extended in various ways by the Stoics and Cicero and the medieval scholastics. Then there's the ancient Chinese tradition, including both the Confucians and the Taoists. And then in the 18th century, there's the sentimentalist tradition, of which David Hume and Adam Smith are probably the two most prominent figures. Now, the particular version of virtue ethics I'm most interested in is the ancient Greek version, the one that basically runs from Socrates through Aquinas and the later scholastics. There's a lot that I value in the sentimentalist tradition and in the Confucian and Taoist traditions, but they're not the version I mainly want to focus on today. So, what is distinctive about the Greek version is that it conceives virtue as part of our ultimate end. So first there's the idea that each of us has an ultimate end. Every action has some end or goal, and the Socratics, the Aristotelians think that we can't coherently think of ourselves as simply having a grab bag of ultimate ends without them fitting together in some way, because we have to make trade-offs. We have to choose what to do. When you have to decide which of your ultimate ends to spend more time pursuing here and now as opposed to which other one, then you're engaging in an action of deliberation, and that's a purposive activity. It has to have an end, and that end has got to be something like a general overarching end of having all your ends fit together harmoniously, or something like that, and that's what the Greeks called eudaimonia, well-being, happiness, flourishing. And the Greeks think of virtue, moral virtue, as being part of this this end. So, yeah, is virtue chosen for its own sake, or is it chosen for the sake of some further end? Well, that's a question that divides the deontologists from the consequentialists. But choosing something because it's part of an end isn't quite either of those things. I mean, you're not choosing it merely as a strategy. You're choosing it as an essential part. And so the question, would you still choose it if there was some other way of getting the end, isn't going to come up, because the end is simply as defined in terms of having these constituent parts. But on the other hand, the virtues aren't valued simply sort of standing independently. They're valued as part of the total system of everything you value. And the content of the virtues is determined by your, what you can coherently conceive of yourself as in terms of your rational moral agency. One feature of the Greek theory of virtue ethics is, to borrow a term from Douglas Denial, that it tends to stress a supply-sided or supply-side aspect of virtue. What do I mean by that? Well, lots of moral theories explain why we should treat other people in certain ways by focusing mainly on facts about them and their needs. So, why shouldn't I treat you in such and such a way because of facts about you? Whereas supply-sided reasons for treating you a certain way are going to have to do with facts about me. So that would be, if the main reason that I shouldn't mistreat you is a fact about you, that's sort of a demand-side aspect. Whereas if the main reason I shouldn't mistreat you is a fact about me, it's a supply-side aspect. Now, of course, any account of how I should treat you is going to take into account facts about me and facts about you, obviously. So any theory is going to have both supply-side and demand-side aspects. But the Greek theory tends to stress these more, to stress the supply-side aspects more, and to say that the reason that I should respect your rights is that dealing with other people through reason and persuasion rather than through force is just inherently a more rational and therefore more human mode of acting. Now, another thing that the Greek tradition tends to stress is this idea of the unity of virtue. Now, this is sometimes defined as the idea that you can't have one virtue without having them all. And in Socrates' version, it was simply the view that all the different virtues are really just the same state under different names. And the Stoics more or less held that too. Aristotle doesn't hold it in that radical a form. Aristotle thinks that you can't have any one virtue completely without having all the others completely. But he thinks you can have some virtues, you could be 90% courageous and only 50% honest or something like that. You could have them to different degrees. It's just that having any one of them completely requires having them all. But the important part of the unity of virtue for me is not the claim itself, but the reason for it, which is that the content of the virtues can't be settled independently of the content of the other virtues. You can't fully settle the content of any one virtue apart from the others. So to take an instance of why you might think this, suppose that I've borrowed something from you, so it's your property, and I'm on my way back to your house to give it back. And a mugger approaches me and demands that I hand the item over. So there are two virtues that become relevant here. So the virtue of justice is the virtue of, at least among other things, of respecting people's rights, of giving people what they are owed. And so justice will tell me what I owe to you in respect of returning your property. But justice doesn't necessarily say that I have to return your property at all possible costs. Because justice wants to take into account other considerations. It can't be the case that I have an obligation to return your property no matter what, especially if it's something trivial and the cost is great. So I borrowed a bottle of lemonade from you and I'm on my way to give it back, and if I refuse to hand it over to the mugger, the mugger will chop me into bits with his giant sword. So you might think, well, justice, I'm not being unjust if I hand the lemonade over. So justice will tell me what what price I am obligated to pay, how much trouble I have to go through in order to return your property. Another virtue that's relevant here is courage. Courage is the virtue of that determines when and under what circumstances they should face danger. And for these Greek thinkers, it's not the case that you should face danger, no matter what, in order to be courageous. They generally distinguish between facing dangers that are worth the risk and facing dangers that are not worth the risk. Because courage is supposed to be calling someone courageous is supposed to be a term of praise. And therefore, we shouldn't apply the term courageous to things that we don't admire. So, is it courageous to rush into a burning building? Well, for the Greeks, it depends why you're doing it. If you're rushing into a burning building to save a loved one, then that's a risk worth taking, they would say. And so they'd call it courageous. But if you're rushing into a burning building to save your ham sandwich that you left on the 9th floor, then they'd say it's not a risk worth taking, so they wouldn't want to call it courageous, because that would imply an endorsement or admiration of it. So courage does not say, you should take, risks whenever they come. It says you should take those risks that are worth taking. So, courage will not necessarily tell me I have to resist the mugger. It will, it'll tell me that, I should resist the mugger, if the risk is worth taking. And whether the risk is worth taking or not depends on two things. First, it depends on how dangerous the mugger is. It also depends on how important it is to return this property to you. So, now, how dangerous the mugger is something that sort of is independent of the question of what I owe you. It's just, is this mugger actually armed? Is this mugger stronger than I am? Etc. Sorry, my screen goes. Oh, I don't. It probably didn't. Nothing probably happened for you, and my screen goes dark if I don't, touch the mouse periodically. So. How dangerous the mugger is that aspect of the, is this a risk worth taking, is independent of any other moral considerations. But the other consideration is how important it is for me to return this property to you, because whether something is courageous or not is not determined simply by the absolute level of danger. It's the absolute level of danger given, the importance of risking it. Now, that's why you can't just say, it's courageous to run into a burning building that has, X% chance of killing you. It depends whether it's worth it or not. And so I can't fully answer the question of whether this is a risk worth taking, independently of the question of what justice requires of me. But justice, likewise, which says that justice in effect requires me to take all reasonable steps to return your property. But what counts as a reasonable step to returning your property is going to depend on what courage requires of me. So I can't fully settle the question of what justice requires of me independent of what courage requires of me, and vice versa. So that's the reason that you can't have one virtue completely without having them all, because having complete virtue, having complete courage would mean being prepared to make the right decision in any risk situation I might possibly face. And that would have to require, input from all the other virtues whenever they're relevant. And that's why I couldn't be 100% courageous without being 100% just. However, I could have a general disposition to face, to face danger, but I might not be so good in the Justice Department, and so therefore I might have more courage than justice, according to Aristotle, even if not according to Socrates. Okay, so then if you think about consequence-oriented virtues, virtues that are mainly about consequences, not solely, but mainly. So, for example, the virtue of benevolence is mainly of focusing on producing beneficial consequences for other people. And the virtue of prudence is mainly about producing beneficial consequences for yourself. And you can think of justice as more of a deontological virtue. It's more about respecting people's rights, following certain rules. And virtue ethicists have always treated justice a little bit differently from the other virtues in that respect. When Aristotle talks about justice, he suddenly talks about all these things about arithmetical proportions and geometrical proportions and all this sort of very rigid rule-governed stuff that doesn't seem to apply in the other virtues. And likewise, to switch to a different virtue ethical tradition, Adam Smith says that justice is different from the other virtues because justice has much more precise rules than the other virtues. He says it's like grammar, whereas the rules of grammar, whereas the other virtues are more like the rules of good writing style. Hume says similar things. So justice is a more deontological virtue than prudence or benevolence. But if the unity of virtue is right, then the content of these virtues is interentailing, which means you can't fully specify the content of any one virtue independently of specifying the others. Now, it's not circular because each one has some preliminary, rough and ready content of its own to start with. But then you refine that and make it more precise through mutual reciprocal determination with the other virtues. So that means that considerations of prudence and benevolence are going to play a role in shaping the content of justice. So and since those are heavily, not solely, but heavily consequentialist, that means that concern about consequences for other people and for yourself are going to play a part in determining the content of justice. So that's a score for the consequentialists. But it works the other way too. You can't fully settle the content of either prudence or benevolence independently of the content of justice, which means that concerns about justice are going to play a role in determining what counts as a good consequence. And that's why someone like Socrates can say that you're better off suffering injustice than committing it, because what counts as a good consequence is determined by the content of justice, so that there are there are going to be cases where we don't simply hold fixed a pre-theoretical conception of what counts as human benefit and then say that justice has to be answerable to that. The concept of human benefit can be revised in order to make it fit justice. Now, the Stoics were people who wanted to revise the concept of human benefit pretty radically in order to fit in with their conceptions of the virtues. And so that's why and Socrates too was actually pretty close to the Stoics in a lot of these ways. As they want to so radically revise the concept of self-interest that it's impossible for anyone to be harmed by anything other than their own failure to be virtuous. But that seems to be placing having too much of the arrows go one way and not the other. I think Aristotle has a more plausible view. Aristotle agrees that the content of justice is plays a role in shaping the content of self-interest, but he thinks that there are sort of commonsensical constraints on how far you can transform self-interest. So for him, it's going to be a two-way street of what determines what. And so this gives us, this explains why we tend to expect good things to both be, in our and others' self-interest and to be sort of consistent with respect for personhood and that kind of thing. And this offers us a way past the impasse of the consequentialists versus the deontologists. Now, you might wonder, if this virtue ethical eudaimonistic approach is so good for libertarianism, why is it that most of the people who held this view historically had pretty unlibertarian political theories? So, for example, Plato and Aristotle, to take the most famous examples, both favored having political institutions set up in order to promote virtue. Plato's was more extreme this way than Aristotle's, but Aristotle's has it too. They both reject the idea of the freedom to do whatever you want as a democratic Athenian idea. And they reject that as sort of part of the vulgar common view that they're rebelling against. They think that it's a mistake to think of freedom as the proper goal of politics. For them, virtue is the proper goal of politics, and they think that the state should be set up in order to promote virtue. So if virtue ethics, why isn't this a reason then to think that virtue ethics naturally leads to some kind of virtue-oriented paternalistic politics and not to libertarianism? Well, here's what I would say to that. I think that when the Greek virtue ethicists make these political conclusions, and they don't all do it equally so, but when they do it, I think they're ignoring some of their own principles. They are forgetting what I called earlier the supply side aspect of ethics, that term I borrowed from Doug Denial, although I think he's also guilty of this. He and Doug Rasmussen in their series of books. Anyway, so what Plato and Aristotle do is they start thinking that that given this orientation toward virtue, that means that the purpose of the state should be to promote the virtue of the people in it. So that if I am a decision maker in the state, my goal should be to act in ways that will make the citizens more virtuous. But that's a demand side approach, and it's fine as far as it goes. There's nothing wrong with taking into account what ways in which political institutions tend to promote virtue. But what it's ignoring is how my own virtue as a political decision maker is affected by how I treat other people. So if I am imposing things on other people by force, if I'm dealing with them through force rather than through reason and persuasion, then that's going to be a problem with my own virtue, and that's with my own flourishing. And so even if I could promote your virtue by forcing something on you, and therefore by promote your well-being, it seems if you're going to be a strict and consistent sort of supply-side oriented eudaimonist, that you're concerned for your own flourishing. You're concerned to live a more human life, a life of dealing with others by a reason and persuasion rather than force would be in your interest. And by the same token, I think that Doug Denial in his book in his series of books with Rasmussen, they tend to treat rights as ways of protecting people's flourishing. So again, that's sort of a demand side way of thinking about rights, which I think is is in tension with Doug Denial's supply side idea. If the reason I should respect rights is mainly because doing that allows you to flourish, that's more of a demand side conception. And of course, there's room for that. That's part of the story. But for a Greek-oriented view, that seems like a more fundamental reason should be that I'm violating my own flourishing by violating your rights, because by dealing with you through violence rather than through reason, I am I'm degrading my own nature. I'm not living up to a truly human way of thinking. And sometimes these Socratic thinkers will say that. Aristotle, for example, raises the question: would it be appropriate for someone to try and become a dictator in order to promote lots and lots of virtuous results? And he says no, because they would undermine their own virtue by doing so. So I mean, they will say the right kinds of things, but I think they sometimes tend to lose track of that because they think that if virtue is the focus of their moral theory, then it has to be the goal of the political system. And also, of course, another problem is that a lot of these thinkers didn't really have a strong distinction between society and state. Now, I think that the Athenian Democrats sort of did, not quite the way we'd want them to, but they did draw a distinction between society and state. But I think that a lot of the philosophers tended to think that if you treat the state as merely sort of a convenient tool for protecting one another from injustice, then you're in effect treating society that way too, and you're thinking that the only purpose of societal relations is as a kind of mutual non-aggression pact, the view that Glaucon sort of grudgingly defends in the second book of Plato's Republic. In other words, they tend to think that if the state is an artificial contrivance, then society would have to be too. And since they think that society, is more something we're organically connected with, they think that the state has to be too. But again, I don't think that follows from any of their principles. Okay, so why don't we move to the Q&A/discussion section of this. However that works.
All right. If you'd like to ask questions, you can ask in above the chat window. Let's try this. Okay, our first question is from Corey Massimino. How does acting rationally, our ultimate end, entail acting virtuously?
Okay, well, the argument that Aristotle gives is that if something is your ultimate end, then then it seems like you should want to do it well. So if your ultimate end were to play the violin, it'd be sort of weird to have your whole life organized around playing the violin, but be satisfied just sort of barely scratching out some kind of a half-assed tune on it. It seems as though if something is your ultimate goal, you should want to do it well, or excellently. Now, the Greek term for excellence and the Greek term for virtue are the same thing, arete. But, of course, not all virtue is moral virtue. So, even if it's part of our goal to do something excellently, how is that going to get us to the moral virtues? Well, Aristotle tends to think of the moral virtues as being involving having the right emotional responses to things. So the emotions for Aristotle are not just raw feelings. They are and they are tools of cognition. They embody judgments, value judgments, and if you've got your your head working right, they will, or your heart working right if you're in Aristotle, because the head's just a refrigerating tool, according to him. Anyway, if you've got your cognitive organs working right, then they will be reliable. And what the virtues seem to do is to track our emotional responses onto what is the most truly human way of living. So Aristotle always is concerned with avoiding falling into two kinds of extremes. So in this case, Aristotle says we should not try to live the life of a beast or a god. What does he mean by that? Well, if you try to live the life of a beast, that means you're living a life that doesn't engage your fully human side. Therefore, it's not really our life. It's the life of sort of a lower aspect of us. So that's one kind of mistake you can make. The other kind of mistake you can make is trying to live too godlike a life, focusing on ourselves as though we were simply something like disembodied intellects and ignoring our embodied vulnerable nature. So Aristotle tends to think that Socrates and Plato are making the godlike mistake, that when they say it's impossible for a virtuous person to be harmed, they're ignoring the importance of our vulnerable embodied animal side. But then people who are cowardly and afraid to face danger, or people who are too stingy, are going to be people who are overvaluing their animal side. So Aristotle thinks that it's possible to have sort of rational emotions that embody the correct rational judgments, and those are going to be the ones that most fully express our being human.
That was quite an answer. Now, how do your conclusions on this virtue ethics approach, how do they relate to the conclusions of Geoffrey Plauchet in his dissertation?
Well, our views are pretty similar. It's been a while since I read his dissertation, so I've forgotten. I remember we disagreed about something, but I can't remember what. That wasn't a very interesting answer, but we are on similar projects.
Astrid asks, how does this approach to ethics take post-structuralism and modern sociology into account? and it looks like there was going to be more to that question, but it got cut off.
Okay, well, um, different things that question might mean, but probably, one thing it might mean is that post-structuralism gives us a kind of worry about essentialist conceptions of human nature. So if you think that an Aristotelian account assumes that there's some definite, fixed, biologically given human nature that's normative for us, and then if you take the arguments of people like Foucault, according to which there isn't any kind of sort of given, or Sartre for that matter, although Sartre's sort of an odd case. You can see sort of Foucault trying to do to Sartre what Sartre did to everyone else. That is, Sartre says, we don't have any definite nature. It's just, this freedom to be whatever. But then that sort of turns into a kind of human nature for him, and you can see Foucault has been kind of critical of that and thinking that there's more role for social construction there. What I'd want to say is that I think it's a mistake to think of human nature in the Aristotelian sense as being sort of biologically given, just sort of something that's provided by our meat. I think it's more of a praxeological conception. It's what conception of ourselves can we make sense of? Now, the fact that we are embodied meat is going to be relevant, and the fact that we are intellectual, rational beings is going to be relevant to what kind of conception of ourselves we can make sense of. But I don't think it's something we can just read off of biology. It's something that we get through rational deliberation. And I think there's a role for social construction. I think the self is in some ways socially constructed, but there are limits to how the self can be socially constructed. Not just every way of socially constructing things is possible. So to take an analogy, money is a social construct, and you can't read the nature of money just simply off. You can't just look at some gold and say, "Aha, that's got to be money." Depends. Different societies use different things for money. Some things are more suitable for money than others. For example, there are places in Africa where they use camels as money. It seems they're not ideal. It's not good. They don't keep as well. You don't. If you just put them in a storehouse, you come back, it'll be dead. Unlike the gold, which won't have changed. And it's hard to make change with a camel, but it's doable. You can make change by just handing over a certificate that represents a portion of the camel rather than actually handing over the portion of the camel, and it's doable. But there are limits to what kinds of things we could use as money. I used to always say you can't use clouds as money, and this is before the term cloud meant what it meant now, the data cloud, and maybe Bitcoin is using cloud as money. But I mean, sort of, the clouds, the old-fashioned kinds of clouds, there's water vapor up there in the sky that floats around. We can't use it as money because there's no way to transfer it or control where it goes or anything. So although money is a social construct, A, it is physically embodied. The things that are money are physical things, and B, there are limits on what kinds of social construction we can do. So, so I want to honor both the essentialists and the anti-essentialists as each being partly right, which is, I've been told that my position is that people who are right and people who are wrong are both saying the same thing. So I guess I'm living up to that today.
And the second part that got cut off, Astrid made the comment that virtue ethics seems to rely on a bizarre concept of the self. Do you have any thoughts on that? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I don't know what the bizarre conception is.
I'd like to put out a call for more questions here, but in the meantime, I'll let people know what we've got going on next week here at Liberty Me Live. It's gonna take a little while for me to switch the branding in my head. Sunday night, Jeffrey Tucker will be continuing his Liberty Classics series with the use of knowledge in society by F.A. Hayek. Monday night, G.P. Manish will start his series on economic calculation and socialism. Tuesday night, we've got Larry Reed from Fee. He'll be talking about a student's essay that changed the world. That's going to be a really fun talk, so I definitely recommend that. Wednesday night, Mike DiBaggio and his wife Shell will be talking about the book they did together, House of Refuge, which is free to Liberty Me members. And then Thursday, we've got the second session of Jeffrey Tucker's series on the man of the century, Mises and his works. And then the start of another really fun course. I think it's going to be 7 sessions with Zach Slayback. It's called Love, Hate, and the State, an introduction to the moral psychology of politics. So it's going to be a great week next week here at Liberty Me Live. So I look forward to seeing you all. We've got more questions. Corey Massimino asks, according to virtue ethics, are there exceptions to the non-aggression principle, and why?
Okay, so, according to virtue ethics, virtue ethics as such doesn't take a stand on it. There are many different flavors. So I guess the question is, according to my version of virtue ethics, are there? No, but, asterisk, I think that the various moral concepts that we use, justice, rights, benevolence, aggression, and so forth, are going to be interdefined, and their content is determined by these mutual relationships. And so the content of aggression is to some extent going to be determined by these other values. Of course, the content of the other values is also going to be determined by the content of aggression. So it's not the case that the concept of aggression becomes infinitely elastic and so on. But nevertheless, I think that, for example, so take a concrete example. So the question of, do you get to steal something if you're starving? And is that, if you do, is that an exception to the non-aggression principle? What I would want to say is that, yes, you do get to steal if you're starving. You thereby acquire a duty to compensate the person, or to make reasonable efforts to compensate the person where possible. I want to say that in that case, your stealing is not aggression. What would be aggression is to steal without accepting the duty to compensate. So I think that the content of exactly what the non-aggression principle asks of us is responsive to these other values, but it also it pulls in the others in its own direction as well. So that for example, although my concern with prudence in this case, if I'm starving, my concern with my self-interest is, in this case, shaping the contours of the concept of aggression. It works the other way too, that my concept of what's in my self-interest may have to be revised in order to meet requirements of what counts as aggression.
Great answer. Our next is a question that I had myself, but Reagan asked, what's the best way to get up to speed on this subject? Could you recommend some books or essays that would get somebody to where they understand what you've already said in this lecture?
Okay, let's see. Well, Jeff Plauchet's dissertation that was mentioned earlier. As I said, my memory of it is vaguer than I'd like it to be, but I think that's online, I believe. It used to be. Would be useful. Let's see. Well, actually, a few years ago, I gave a week-long seminar at the Mises Institute that I'm in the course of transcribing, and I'm going to release as a book in the next couple of months. And that contains some of the stuff I've just been talking about. There's an essay by Julia Annas, A-N-N-A-S, called Happiness as Achievement, that I would recommend. And also there's an article by Rosalind Hursthouse, H-U-R-S-T-H-O-U-S-E, called Virtue Theory and Abortion. And I don't find what she says about abortion particularly interesting. I don't either strongly agree with it or strongly disagree with it. But in the course of setting up the issue of abortion, she says some really interesting things about the nature of virtue ethics. So I think that, so the Annis piece and the Hursthouse piece are good introductions to to something like the view I'm talking about.
And I've linked to a couple of those in the chat below there. Jeff's dissertation and then the Annis piece, and then I'll work on the others. But our next question is from NP. Your personal thoughts on the usefulness of the trolley problem?
I'm neither one of the great lovers of those problems nor one of the great haters of them. So let me say what's good and bad about them. I think that weird thought experiments have their value because principles have counterfactual implications. If you're committed to a principle, that means you're committed to doing certain things in various possible conceivable situations. And so if your moral principle has an upshot that in some weird situation you ought to do X, but if it seems to us in reflection that we really want to say that in a weird situation we ought not to do X, then there's an interesting conflict between our moral intuition and this principle, and we have to think about how to resolve it. So these weird situations have their uses, and that's why to take one of the earliest examples in the history of philosophy of a weird example, you have once again, Book 2 of Plato's Republic, where Plato introduces this notion of Gyges' ring, a magic ring that turns you invisible, so you can go around killing people and stealing stuff and so on without being caught, as a way of severing unjust behavior from its usual bad effects on reputation and so forth, so that for those who thought that as Glaucon had suggested, not fully endorsing the view, but suggesting it as a likely possibility, that the reason to be just is that a general practice of being just tends to attract rewarding behavior from others, sort of Axelrod before his time kind of thing. This suggests some worries about that approach. The downside of things like the trolley problem is that often there's a tendency, rather than thinking about these cases and how they interact with general moral principles and arguments about those, there's often a tendency to just sort of focus on the problems in isolation from all other moral considerations and just have some kind of gut reaction to the problem and then say, all right, well, I'm going to treat my gut reaction to this problem as sort of decisive for resolving these ethical questions. Whereas I want to say, well, your gut reaction to the trolley problem is not decisive. I think there's a kind of balance between general principles and particular cases, and if there's a conflict between the particular case you find most plausible and the general principle you find most plausible, then there's room for mutual adjustment, but it's not the case that one of the side automatically wins. So some people say, well, you should stick to the general principle no matter what crazy conclusions it turns out to have. And the other view would say, no, we have to save all our particular intuitions no matter what the general principle turns out to be. And I think that both of those are wrong. I mean, sometimes our gut reactions are wrong. Our gut reactions can be shaped by all kinds of prejudices. I mean, when Cicero was thinking about moral problems, he comes up with the question, is it okay for a slave to kill his master and escape? And Cicero thinks, well, no, of course not. Whereas, if you follow some general principle, Cicero's general moral principles about treating other people with respect and so forth would naturally tend to condemn slavery. But he has this particular judgment in favor of slavery that he just takes for granted because he lives in enslaved society and benefits from it. So I don't think that our particular judgment should always automatically trump things. On the other hand, I think they have some weight. So once again, it's a matter of mutual adjustment.
Our next question is from Ryan Troyer. He asks, does your version of virtue ethics say anything about aesthetics in the arts?
I think that, I don't know whether this is exactly part of virtue ethics, but I think that there are some some similarities, and the branch of virtue ethics that's done the most to talk about those similarities is not the Greek version so much as the 18th century version. So people like David Hume and Adam Smith and Francis Hutcheson and Edmund Burke developed theories of aesthetics that were explicitly modeled on their theories of ethics. Now, their version of virtue ethics I partly like and partly don't, but I think there are some. I think there are some connections. The one thing I like about the Greek version of virtue ethics, and it's something that I think that the 18th century sentimentalists were going for but didn't always achieve, is the way in which value judgments can be objective without being judgments of some kind of radically transcendent things that are completely disconnected from from the human. Now, Plato would be an exception there. Plato obviously thinks that there is such a thing as the form of beauty that has nothing to do with us or our lives and just exists in its own right. But I think that some of the things that Smith and Hume say about so Hume has this essay called On the Standard of Taste, and Burke. I don't often cite Burke favorably, but Burke has this essay on the sublime and beautiful, and the opening being on taste. I mean, it's very psychologistic. It's all about facts about our human psychological tendencies to value things, and that I'm not such a big fan of. But he makes the point that there isn't as much divergence in aesthetic taste as we might think there is. So, for example, you might think that if two people read the same poem and one person loves it and one person hates it, you might think, well, clearly we have a basic difference in taste there. But that might not be the case, because suppose I read you a poem in a language you don't know. Then, if you don't get anything out of it, it's not a sign of a difference in taste. It's because you don't, it's because you don't know it. Or, take a less radical example. Suppose you read some story that's full of inaccuracies. It might be historical inaccuracies or technical inaccuracies or something. So it might be you're reading a detective story and it says that the detective jammed another clip into his revolver. And if you know anything about guns, you think, what does that mean? And it might interfere with your enjoyment of the story. If you don't know anything about guns, then it doesn't bug you. Or the example Burke gives is if you're reading a story that talks about people being shipwrecked on the seacoast of Bohemia, of course that's a reference to a Shakespeare play. If you know that Bohemia doesn't have a seacoast, that may bug you. But if you don't know that, it won't. And so, in that case, there's simply a difference in knowledge. So I think in a lot of cases of aesthetic disagreements, it's cases where a lot of disagreements is the matter of what people are paying attention to. It's not simply purely subjective. I'm not sure how direct an answer that is. It doesn't particularly connect with the virtue ethics.
But our next question is from Chris Hudson. Chris asks, what has been your experience discussing ethics with left anarchists, such as social anarchists? Is there normally a good overlap with different conclusions?
Well, social anarchists, it's not always clear to me what their ethical theories are, because they a lot of them sort of tend to be suspicious of lots of traditional ethical ways of talking. So most of my discussions with left anarchists and social anarchists have been at a more intermediate level, not at the basic level of ethical foundations. The closest thing, it's someone who's an individualist anarchist, but has some roots in the social anarchist scene, would be William Gillis, with whom I share a lot of agreements when it comes to sort of conclusions, but when it comes to ethical foundations, we agree on almost nothing. He's uh, sort of a radical utilitarian for whom the utilities are for degrees of freedom rather than anything to do with individual persons. And so if we were all merged into a giant hive mind that achieved great freedom, then we would be obligated to bring that about. He said that. That's not my parody of his view. That's his view. I don't know whether he counts as a social anarchist or not, but he's someone who has more background in that milieu than most of the people I interact with. He doesn't even like to be called a
Jason,
leftist, even though he's more leftist than I am.
Jason asks, what are your thoughts on Alasdair MacIntyre and his particular formulation of virtue ethics?
Yeah, well, he's someone I was influenced by a fair bit in college, though I also resisted a fair bit as well. So MacIntyre has this idea that the problem with modern moral philosophy is that with the collapse of the Aristotelian worldview, we lost the idea of human nature as having a goal or a telos. And now, at least in After Virtue, I'm not as familiar with his more recent stuff, so I'm going by the book that influenced me the most. In After Virtue, he you know, he rejects sort of biological essentialism. He doesn't think that there is any sort of naturally given end, and so he thinks that the end has to be given by social traditions. Of course, I want to find an intermediate way between those options. So he thinks that our social traditions give us these social roles. Actually, it's very Confucian in a way. The social traditions give us these social roles, and these social roles define what the telos or goal is for us. And then the virtues are going to be the virtues that make a life shaped in accordance with that telos work out. So, I liked a lot of what he said about the structure of moral theory, but I didn't agree that it had to be quite so based on traditions as his is. But as I said, this is based on After Virtue. I know that he got more Thomistic later, and I don't know whether the changes are for good or ill or both. Probably both, which is a safer guess.
Well, thank you so much for that answer and all the others, and for giving this talk tonight. It's been tremendously informative. Thanks, everyone, for coming. We hope to have you back, Dr. Long. Thanks so much. Take care, everyone. Have a great night.
For fun. Okay, thank you.
Great. Thanks, everyone, and thanks for bearing with our technical problems for our first night on Adobe Connect.
I've been with one eye, I've been reading all these chat things. Discovery of color.
Yes, it's a very important moment for the ego, I guess. Not everybody.
Respecting personhood in its own right or something like that. But nevertheless, the values that you hold all seem to involve respecting personhood, and you seem to favor acting as though we believed in natural rights for their own sake, and you try to show that consequentialism doesn't entail nasty consequences like sacrificing the few to the many and so forth, that if you're a utilitarian, or sacrificing others to yourself if you're an egoist. The consequentialists try to show that their theories don't have that implication, and that makes it seem as though there's some kind of crypto-deontologists. So there's that worry. And also there are some, broadly speaking, praxeological worries about both positions. So with regard to consequentialism, here's a kind of praxeological worry about it. Praxeological in the sense of arising from sort of conceptual problems about the nature of action. So one thing that seems to be generally agreed on by consequentialist libertarians is that the best way to promote good consequences is to adopt certain very general settled policies and to hold to them pretty firmly, and not be too ready to recognize exceptions. So for people with a more utilitarian bent, like Mises or Hayek are crazy, you are committed to liberty regardless of its results, so that if it turned out that liberty had horrific consequences, that the libertarian society would be one that would be a nightmare of civil war and poverty and mass death and so forth, that you'd still be in favor of it. Also, each side accuses the other side of hypocrisy, because the consequentialists will point out that the deontologists, although they say that their reasons for favoring liberty don't have to do with consequences, nevertheless they all seem to think that in fact liberty will have good consequences. As a matter of fact, most deontological libertarians subscribe to, for example, free market economic theories that say that respecting rights will tend to produce more prosperity and peace and so on, even if they think that that's not the reason for favoring liberty, the fundamental reason. They nevertheless seem to sign on to it, even if they describe it as, in Rothbard's words, gravy. And so the consequentialists think, well, there's some hypocrisy here. Really, the deontologists are crypto-consequentialists. Really, they're smuggling in some kind of consequentialist concern in justifying liberty. But of course, the deontologists can turn around and make a similar accusation against the consequentialists, which is, well, look, you consequentialists say it's the results that you favor, not Eck or the Friedmans. They seem to think that if you try to follow a policy of expediency and are constantly violating libertarian rights, anytime you see some way of gaining some social advantage for that, they tend to think that that will tend to be, make liberty unstable, and that you should stick to these principles pretty firmly. Likewise, if you're an egoist like Ayn Rand, you're going to think that in order to pursue your self-interest, you should commit yourself to general principles and policies and not be constantly looking for ways around them. Libertarian consequentialists tend to be what's called rule consequentialists, not act consequentialists. That is, they tend to think that consequentialism shouldn't be a criterion for determining which individual actions are correct, but rather should be a criterion simply for determining what general rules or policies or principles should be followed. But there's a praxeological worry about this, which is the take the praxeological distinction between producers' goods and consumers' goods. So consumers' goods are goods that are valued for their own sake. Producers' goods are goods that are valued for the sake of their consequences for producing something else. So according to consequentialism, liberty is a producer's good, and respecting rights is a producer's good. It's valued for its consequences. But the rule consequentialist justification for respecting libertarian rights is its consequences. This might take the utilitarian form of consequences for society as a whole, might take an egoist form of consequences for the agent, him or herself, or some mix of the two or something else. But the idea is that the justification for liberty is sort of causally downstream from the rights themselves or from respecting rights. It's the effects, the beneficial effects of respecting liberty. On the other hand, the deontologists, often called the natural rights position, although some natural rights theorists are egoists and it's complicated, but the natural rights position that certain actions are inherently wrong, like violating rights is inherently wrong in and of itself, apart from any consideration of its consequences. And certain criticisms each side makes of the other. So, for example, the deontologists will say, look, so you consequentialists aren't really committed to liberty. Your commitment to liberty simply depends on your happening to think that it has these consequences, but if you could see some way to promote those consequences differently, then you'd betray liberty, and you'd be quite happy to use people as mere means to ends if you could do that. And the consequentialists will say, look, you deontologists.
Hi everyone, and welcome to Liberty Live. Normally it's in the past I've called it Liberty Me You, but we're doing a little rebranding with our move to Adobe Connect. So this is the new space. I think it's going to be a much more dynamic space for us to do 25 plus talks every month. I think it's going to be great. I'm really excited about what we can do with this. But welcome to Liberty Live. We're here tonight with Dr. Roderick Long. Roderick is a professor of philosophy at Auburn University. He blogs at his own blog, Austro-Athenian Empire. He also blogs at Bleeding Heart Libertarians and elsewhere. He's a senior scholar for the Mises Institute, an editor of the Journal of Ayn Rand Studies, director and president of the Molinari Institute, and a senior fellow at the Center for a Stateless Society. And tonight he's going to be talking about virtue ethics, a kind of Aristotelian approach to the question of, how do we get to liberty? So, without further ado, Roderick Long.
Oh, thanks. The libertarian movement for a long time has been divided on the question of the proper foundations, moral foundations for libertarianism, and with the main divide being between, broadly speaking, consequentialists on the one hand, those who think that the